The Civil War. Two men sit across from each other in a Virginia farmhouse. One wears a pristine gray uniform with a ceremonial sword. The other is covered in mud, with boots caked with dirt from the road. The man in gray is surrendering. The man in mud just won America's bloodiest war. April 9th, 1865. Appomattox Courthouse. After 4 years of slaughter that killed over 620,000 Americans, more than every other U.S. war combined through Vietnam, Confederate General Robert E. Lee finally accepted defeat. The war had torn the nation apart. 11 southern states seceded after Abraham Lincoln's election, terrified he would end slavery. They formed the Confederate States of America and built their capital in Richmond, just 100 miles from Washington, close enough to see the smoke. What followed was industrial-scale carnage. Antietam, Gettysburg, Cold Harbor, names that became synonyms for mass graves. By the end, 1 in 4 Southern white men of military age was dead. By April 1865, Lee's army was starving, outnumbered, and surrounded. He rode to a farmhouse owned by a man named Wilmer McLean to meet Grant. Here's an insane coincidence. McLean had moved to Appomattox to escape the war, because the first major battle, Bull Run, had literally been fought on his previous property. The war found him twice. Lee arrived in his finest uniform, expecting to be arrested, maybe executed. Instead, Grant, still covered in mud from riding all night, offered terms so generous they shocked everyone. Confederate soldiers could go home. Officers kept their sidearms. Men who owned horses could keep them for spring planting. No trials, no firing squads, no revenge. The war was over, and the healing could begin. But it lasted just 5 days. On April 14th, Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater. Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth crept into the presidential box, pressed a derringer to the back of Lincoln's head, and fired. The president died the next morning, the first American leader ever assassinated. Booth leaped to the stage, breaking his leg, and shouted, "Thus always to tyrants," before escaping into the night. He was cornered 12 days later in a burning barn and shot dead. But here's what nobody expected. The war kept going. News traveled slowly in 1865. Confederate units in Texas had no idea Lee had surrendered. They kept fighting for weeks. The last Confederate general to lay down arms was Stanwady, a Cherokee leader, on June 23rd. 2.5 months after Appomattox, the Civil War ended slavery. It preserved the Union. But the man who held it all together never saw the peace he fought for. Abraham Lincoln was buried in Springfield, Illinois. The wounds he tried to heal are still bleeding today. World War II. Pacific. The night before Japan surrendered, a group of army officers tried to stop it. They stormed the Imperial Palace in Tokyo, hunting for a recording. Emperor Hirohito had just taped a message announcing Japan's surrender, the first time any Japanese citizen would ever hear his voice. The rebels wanted to destroy it. They believed Japan should fight to the last man, woman, and child. Even after 2 atomic bombs had vaporized Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Even after the Soviet Union had invaded Manchuria. They killed the commander of the Imperial Guard. They searched room by room for hours. They forged orders, cut phone lines, and tried to seize the national broadcast system, but they never found it. The recording had been hidden in a pile of laundry inside a servant's quarters. By dawn, the coup collapsed. Several officers knelt on the palace grounds, drew their swords, and disemboweled themselves. On August 15, 1945, radios across Japan broadcast the emperor's voice for the first time in history. He spoke in formal, ancient court Japanese that many ordinary citizens couldn't even understand. But one word cut through: surrender. Women collapsed in the streets. Soldiers fell to their knees. Thousands of military officers killed themselves rather than accept defeat. Some with swords, others with grenades, many right in front of the Imperial Palace. 2 weeks later, the war officially ended aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Japanese officials in top hats and morning coats stood on the deck, facing General Douglas MacArthur. Behind him stood 2 ghosts, General Wainwright, who had surrendered the Philippines, and General Percival, who had surrendered Singapore. Both had just been freed from Japanese prison camps. Both had been tortured. Now they watched their captors sign the surrender. MacArthur kept the ceremony short, just 18 minutes. When the Japanese finished signing, over 1,000 American planes roared overhead in formation. The most devastating war in Pacific history was over. 2 million Japanese were dead. Over 100,000 Americans. 2 entire cities had been erased by weapons that would haunt humanity forever. An empire that stretched from China to the gates of Australia had collapsed in 4 years, but not everyone got the message. Japanese soldiers scattered across remote Pacific islands had no working radios. Some kept fighting for years. Second Lieutenant Hiru Onoda, stationed in the Philippines, refused to believe the war was over. He waged a one-man guerrilla campaign in the jungle for nearly 3 decades. In March 1974, 29 years after the Missouri, his former commanding officer flew to the Philippines and personally ordered him to stand down. Onoda emerged from the jungle in his tattered uniform, handed over his sword, and finally accepted that the war was over. The empire of the rising sun had set, but some of its soldiers never saw the darkness fall. The Vietnam War, the most powerful military in human history, lost to rice farmers in sandals. For 20 years, America tried everything. 500,000 troops, more bombs than all of World War II combined, chemical weapons that poisoned the jungle, and the soldiers who sprayed them. But none of it worked. By April 1975, South Vietnam was collapsing faster than anyone predicted. Cities that were supposed to hold for months fell in hours. The North Vietnamese army rolled south along Highway 1 like a flood, and nothing could stop them. President Nguyen Van Thieu resigned on April 21st, cursing the Americans who had promised to save his country. He fled to Taiwan carrying suitcases full of gold. 9 days later, it was over. On the morning of April 30th, North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of the Independence Palace in Saigon. President Duong Van Minh, who had been in office for just 43 hours, sat waiting in the cabinet room. When a North Vietnamese officer burst in and demanded his surrender, Minh said he was ready to transfer power peacefully. The officer cut him off. "You have no power to transfer. You can only surrender unconditionally." At 2:30 p.m., Minh's voice crackled over Radio Saigon, announcing the end of the Republic of Vietnam, a country erased in a single sentence. But the real nightmare had begun hours earlier. Operation Frequent Wind was the largest helicopter evacuation in history, and the most desperate. Ambassador Graham Martin had refused to believe Saigon would fall, delaying the evacuation until it was almost too late. When the order finally came, thousands of Vietnamese who had worked with Americans stormed the embassy gates, fighting to reach the helicopters on the roof. Marines used rifle butts to push back the crowds. Families were torn apart. Mothers threw children over barbed wire fences to strangers. The last Marine helicopter lifted off at 7:53 a.m. on April 30th, leaving behind thousands of Vietnamese allies. Many were sent to re-education camps. Some were executed. Others spent decades in prison for the crime of trusting America. 58,000 Americans came home in coffins. 300,000 came home wounded. Millions of Vietnamese, North and South, were dead. And in the end, the country was reunified under communist rule. Exactly what Ho Chi Minh had wanted from the beginning. Exactly what America had spent 20 years trying to prevent. The war that was supposed to stop dominoes from falling ended with America climbing a ladder to a helicopter, desperate to escape the disaster it had created. Korean War. The Korean War never actually ended. On July 27, 1953, generals from both sides gathered in a small building at Panmunjom. They didn't sign a peace treaty. They signed an armistice, a temporary pause in the fighting. The document explicitly stated it would remain in effect until a final peaceful settlement is achieved. 70 years later, we're still waiting. The war began at dawn on June 25, 1950, when 75,000 North Korean soldiers poured across the 38th parallel. Within 3 days, they captured Seoul. Within 6 weeks, they had pushed American and South Korean forces into a tiny pocket around Pusan, just 10% of the country. It looked like total annihilation. Then General Douglas MacArthur launched one of the most audacious gambles in military history, an amphibious landing at Incheon, deep behind enemy lines. His own planners said the odds were 5,000 to 1 against success. But MacArthur did it anyway. The North Korean army collapsed overnight. UN forces surged north, captured Pyongyang, and pushed toward the Chinese border at the Yalu River. MacArthur wanted total victory, but he got something else entirely. 300,000 Chinese soldiers crossed the Yalu in late October 1950. The Americans never saw them coming. They drove UN forces back in one of the most brutal retreats in U.S. military history. At the Chosin Reservoir, 30,000 Marines and soldiers found themselves surrounded by 120,000 Chinese troops in temperatures of minus 35 degrees. Men's feet froze solid inside their boots. Morphine froze in the syringes. The dead froze so hard they couldn't be buried. When asked if they were retreating, Marine General O.P. Smith said, "Retreat? Hell, we're just advancing in a different direction." By spring 1951, the front lines had stabilized almost exactly where the war began. The 38th parallel. For 2 more years, men died fighting over frozen hills with names like Pork Chop, Heartbreak Ridge, and Old Baldy. The armistice negotiations dragged on for 575 days while the killing continued. Soldiers died for hills that would be abandoned the next week. When the armistice was finally signed, nothing had been won. The border sat almost exactly where it started. Korea remained split in two. Over 36,000 Americans were dead. An estimated 3 million Koreans and Chinese had perished, most of them civilians. North Korea had been bombed so heavily that virtually every building taller than one story was destroyed. The Korean War became the Forgotten War, overshadowed by World War II's glory and Vietnam's trauma. But for the families who lost sons in those frozen mountains, and for the Korean people still living in a nation cut in half, there was nothing to forget. Today, 28,000 American troops still patrol the DMZ. The two Koreas are still technically at war. The armistice that was supposed to be temporary is now the longest truce in modern history. The guns fell silent in 1953. But the war? The war never ended, and the way things are going, it probably never will.